A teamster pulled his wagon to a stop on the Ash Creek Road and stared at the claim site. 12 stone columns stood in the dirt where a cabin should have been. Rough fieldstone, 4 feet high, arranged in rows like something between a graveyard and a cattle pen. He could see clean through them. Wind passed between the columns and moaned. "You buildin' a dock, Mallow?" the teamster called. "River's that way." He pointed east and kept moving. By evening, the settlement had a new phrase. "The hillman's house has legs." Out on the claim, the hillman set another stone on the column he was building. He did not look up. He did not answer. He placed the flat face down, checked the lean, and reached for the next piece. The wagon wheel had frozen into the mud outside the Ash Creek land office 3 days before Rowan Mallow pulled his children down from the seat and carried their trunk inside. That was September of 1887. The clerk stamped a receipt for 160 acres along the James River Prairie in Dakota Territory, and Rowan paid the filing fee with coins he counted twice. Nola, 9 years old, held a cracked slate against her chest. Pike, 6, coughed into a mitten that had already gone dark with use. The nearest rail stop sat 9 miles east. The nearest reliable timber yard was in Huron, nearly 24 miles by wagon over roads that would be impassable by November. Rowan had come from Yancey County, North Carolina, where the mountains taught a man to build on steep ground, or not build at all. He knew spring houses, stone corncrib piers, root cellars cut into hillsides, and the particular way creek water finds wood and rots it from below. None of that mattered here. The prairie was flat, treeless, and open to a wind that started in Canada and did not stop until it hit Kansas. The people who had already settled Ash Creek were German, Norwegian, and Yankee families who had wintered on the plains before. They heard his Appalachian accent and treated his mountain knowledge the way a doctor treats a folk remedy, with patience that looked like pity. His brother-in-law Asa had promised to split the claim work. They had agreed on it in writing, on the back of a feed bill, before leaving North Carolina. Asa would bring the team and the second load of boards. Asa would help raise walls, cut fuel, and dig a root cellar before the ground locked. But Asa had turned east from Yankton after a debt dispute with a freight agent, and he had taken the mule team with him. The letter arrived at the land office 2 days after Rowan filed. It said only, "Cannot proceed. Debt attached to team. Do not expect me before spring." Rowan read the letter standing at the clerk's window. Nola asked what it said. He folded it into his coat and told her they would manage. But the math had collapsed. He had $38 after filing costs, a battered cross-cut saw, 1 froe, 2 axes, a draw knife, 8 sacks of flour, 112 board feet of salvage pine that Asa had dumped at the claim site before turning around, and a cabin frame that stood 8 logs high on bare dirt, a rectangle of notched cottonwood that reached a man's chest and stopped. He could not leave. The filing fee was gone. He had no team to haul the children back to Yankton, no money for rail passage, and no relatives left in North Carolina who could take 3 mouths. The claim was the only thing he owned that was worth more than what he carried. If he walked away, he lost the fee, the lumber, the flour, and every mile the children had traveled. Orrin Maddox arrived on the 4th morning. Maddox was 63, a former carpenter who had built 7 houses in the territory and the town's unofficial building authority. He served as a claim witness for 3 families already, and his opinion could make or break a proving up hearing. He walked the claim site the way a doctor walks a sick room, slowly, touching things, shaking his head before he spoke. "You have half a wall," Maddox said. He kicked the base log. 8 rounds. You need 16 minimum to close, plus ridge, plus rafters. That's another 30 logs, and you have no team to drag them. He pointed at the stacked salvage pine. That is maybe 100 board feet. You need 400 for a floor and roof sheathing alone. He crouched and pressed his hand flat against the dirt inside the frame. This ground will freeze 2 feet down by December. If you lay a floor on this, the cold will come straight through the boards and sit in the room with you. He stood and looked at the children. Nola was pulling Pike's mitten back on. You have less than 2 cords of cut wood. You need 6 for winter, minimum. 8 if it goes long. Rowan asked how deep the frost had gone the previous year. Maddox narrowed his eyes. 3 feet in January, some places 4. Why? Just want to know what the ground does, Rowan said. What the ground does, Maddox repeated, is kill people who are not ready for it. He pulled his collar up. A man who has never wintered on level ground should not improve on the people who have. He left without offering help. He did not need to say what he meant. Rowan understood. Conventional advice said, build low, bank sod against the walls, lay the floor on packed dirt or shallow joists, use every spare hour cutting fuel, and sleep on straw. That was how the territory survived. It worked because it had always worked, and men like Maddox did not separate experience from authority, but building low required fuel that Rowan could not afford. Coal came from Huron at prices that would eat his $38 in 2 loads. Cottonwood grew along creek bottoms, but cutting, splitting, and hauling it without a team meant weeks of labor that competed with every other task. Sod was free, but Rowan's children had both been coughing since the journey. Wet, racking coughs that worsened in damp air. A dirt floor cabin with sod banked to the eaves would keep them alive the way a coffin keeps a body intact, technically enclosed, practically finished. He stood inside the 8-log frame that evening and pressed his boot sole flat against the dirt. It was September, and the ground was already cold enough to feel through leather. By January, this surface would be frozen stone. A floor laid across it, joists on dirt, boards on joists, would act as a bridge between the stove and the earth. Heat would rise from the fire and the frozen ground would pull it down through the wood and swallow it. The stove would fight the planet itself, and the planet would win. He did not have the answer yet. He had only the question, and the question kept him awake that first week while the children slept under every blanket they owned inside the roofless frame, and the stars moved across a sky so wide it made the mountains feel like a dream he had borrowed from someone else. The idea did not arrive whole. It came in fragments, the way a man finds a trail, one broken branch at a time. The first fragment was frost. In the second week of September, Rowan walked to Beret Lund's homestead a half-mile north to return a borrowed bucket. Beret was 42, a Norwegian widow farming 160 acres alone with a hired boy who came twice a week. She was practical, suspicious of men who talked more than they worked, and she had survived 3 Dakota winters in a low cabin banked with sod to the windowsills. Rowan respected her because she did not pretend the plains were kind. She said what was true and expected others to hear it. Her low storage shed sat on a dirt sill, and when Rowan set the bucket inside, he noticed the underside of the floorboards. White frost feathered the wood where it touched the ground. The boards were pulling moisture from the frozen dirt and holding it, but outside, under a haystack 20 feet away, the soil was still soft enough to push a thumb into. The hay was not heating the ground. It was keeping the wind from stealing what warmth the earth still held. The second fragment was accident. Pike dropped a tin cup through a gap in the unfinished cabin floor. Rowan reached between the logs to retrieve it, and his hand entered the space below the boards. Where loose planks blocked the wind, the air felt different, not warm, but less cutting, less active. Where gaps let the wind through, the cold moved like water, blocked the wind, and the air sat still. Still air did not steal heat the way moving air did. The third fragment was memory. His father had built a corn crib on stone piers above wet mountain ground. The crib was raised 3 feet, with air moving freely underneath, and the grain stayed dry because moisture could not climb stone the way it climbed wood sitting in mud. But Rowan remembered something else. In winter, when his father stacked hay bales around the base of the crib, the air underneath went still, and the underside of the floor stayed dry enough to store tools. The cold could not reach through stone, and the wind could not reach through the hay bales, and the small pocket of trapped air did not move enough to carry the cold in. He stood in the half-built frame and looked at the ground. The problem was not just cold air above, it was contact, frozen dirt touching wood, wind stripping heat from below the floor, the boards acting as a conductor between the stove's effort and the earth's hunger. Every cabin in Ash Creek was built to fight the cold by making more heat, but Rowan could not afford more heat. He needed to slow the theft. He marked a 16 by 22-foot rectangle in the dirt with a stick. He used charcoal on a scrap of pine to sketch 12 pier points, 3 rows of 4, spaced 6 feet apart, with the stove load concentrated near the center row where the weight and the heat mattered most. Broad footstones buried just below the topsoil where he could manage it. Battered sides, wider at the base, narrower at the top, so the column tightened under the cabin's weight. Flat capstones shimmed level, and around the entire base a skirt, 4 feet of vertical pine boards battened at the seams, chinked with clay and straw, sealed at the bottom edge with packed earth and later snow. In winter the skirt would be closed tight. In spring, removable panels on the lee side would open for ventilation. The design was not a guess. It was an assembly of things Rowan had seen work in pieces. Stone piers from the mountains, wind blocking from the haystack, still air pockets from the sealed corn crib. The question was whether pieces that worked separately would work together, at scale, on flat ground, in a Dakota winter that made Appalachian cold feel like a mild opinion. Beret found him measuring shadows under the raised frame 2 days later. She had come to check on Nola's cough and found Rowan on his knees with a piece of charcoal, marking where the afternoon sun struck the underside of the test boards he had propped on stones. "You are building a barn for the wind," she said. Rowan did not argue. He took 2 planks and laid them flat on frozen ground, and 2 more planks and set them on stones a foot above the surface. He covered 1 pair with a box made from scrap boards, sealed at the edges with clay. He left the other pair open. "Come back tomorrow," he said. Beret came back. The exposed boards on the ground wore frost feathers on their undersides, thick as fur. The boards on stones, under the sealed box, were dry enough to plane. No frost, no moisture. The still air pocket and the stone separation had done what a stove could not. They had kept the wood above freezing without fire. Beret was unimpressed. "2 boards under a box," she said. "Children do not survive on cleverness." She looked at the sky, which was turning the color of old pewter. "You are losing September on stones while other men are cutting wood." She was right about the cost. Every hour Rowan spent hauling stone was an hour he did not spend cutting fuel. Every dollar he spent on skirt boards was a dollar that could have bought flour. If the piers heaved in frost, and Maddox would say they would, the cabin would twist. The door might jam during a storm, and the children would be trapped in a broken house on a frozen plain. But the conventional path required 6 to 8 cords of fuel he could not cut alone, coal he could not afford, and sod banking that would keep his children coughing in damp air until the damp became pneumonia. The unconventional path required stone, labor, knowledge, and time. Stone was free. Labor was his body. Knowledge was his inheritance. Time was the only gamble, and every path gambled time. The question was, which bet lost less? The mockery started at Leander Voss's store. Voss was 48, the lumber merchant and note holder who supplied most of Ash Creek on credit. He owned the only source of cut boards, nails, stove fittings, and glass within 9 miles. He set prices by need, which meant he set prices by desperation, and every homesteader who bought on credit carried a debt that compounded through winter when no one could pay. Voss did not build. He financed building, and the difference made him the richest man in a settlement where rich meant owning a building with a plank floor. Voss had extended freight credit to Rowan for the first load of salvage pine. The note was small, $11, but the terms required repayment by December or forfeiture of claim. Improvements as collateral. A man who failed to prove up a claim lost everything on it. A man who owed Voss and failed to prove up lost it to Voss specifically. This arrangement was not unusual. It was how Voss had acquired 2 abandoned quarter sections already. The jokes began the day Rowan started hauling stone from a creek cut 2 miles east. A teamster named Drucker saw the 12 charcoal marks on the ground and the first pile of fieldstone and asked if Rowan was building a graveyard. Voss heard the story that evening and repeated it with improvements. By the end of the week, Ash Creek had a new phrase. "Mallow's house has legs," children said. Men driving past the claim site saw 12 lonely stone columns rising from bare prairie like teeth in an empty jaw, and they shook their heads the way people shake their heads at a dog chasing a wagon. Not cruel, just certain of the outcome. Voss turned the laughter into leverage on a Tuesday morning when Rowan came to buy cut nails. The price had risen 2 cents a pound since the previous week. Rowan counted his coins and asked for 10 pounds at the old price. Voss leaned on the counter, a man comfortable with the weight of his own authority, and said, "A house needs roots, Mallow. Yours has legs." The men at the stove laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Rowan said, "So does a man. He still stands." The line did not win the room. It landed like a stone in mud. A small sound, then silence. Voss's eyes changed. The amusement went out of them, and something harder replaced it. He offered Rowan credit for a normal low foundation, sill logs, dirt floor, sod banking, proper and proven. The terms were 3% monthly on materials, payable in spring or by claim improvement value. It was a trap baited with shelter. Rowan would get a warm cabin and a debt he could never clear without selling the claim itself. Rowan refused. He paid cash for 6 pounds of nails at the new price, and he left. Behind him, Voss said something to the men at the stove that Rowan did not hear, but the laughter followed him out the door and across the yard. The refusal turned Voss from a mocker to an opponent. A man who refused credit was a man who refused control, and Voss understood control the way a teamster understands reins. Within the week, he began telling customers that Rowan's stilts would snap in the first north wind. He mentioned to Orrin Maddox over coffee that a claim holder who wasted time on a structure unlikely to survive winter might not deserve his witnesses. The words were casual, the implication surgical. If Maddox and the other witnesses refused to appear at Rowan's proving up hearing, the claim would revert. And reverted claims near a creek with stone and timber access were worth filing on. Bere Lunde's resistance stayed practical. She brought old burlap for Nola's cough, but told Rowan to use it for bedding, not for ceiling boards. "You cannot chink hunger," she said. She did not mock him. She looked at the stone piles and the children and saw the same arithmetic Maddox had recited, and her verdict was the same. This man was spending time he could not afford on an idea that had not been tested. Her doubt hurt more than Voss's ridicule because it came from someone who wished him well. Pike asked Rowan that night why people laughed at the rocks. Rowan told him that people laugh at things they have not seen work yet. Pike asked if the rocks would work. Rowan said he did not know, but the ground was cold and getting colder, and the rocks were the only idea he had that did not cost money he did not own. Construction began the last week of September, and it began with arithmetic that felt like punishment. 12 piers, each one 4 feet above grade, with a broad buried footstone below the topsoil. 3 rows of 4, spanning a 16 by 22-foot rectangle. Each pier required roughly 750 pounds of field stone. Flat pieces preferred, heavy enough to resist wind shear, light enough for one man to lift to chest height. 12 piers meant 9,000 pounds of stone. The creek cut sat 2 miles east, down a slope, and across a flat that turned to gumbo mud after rain. Rowan had no team. He had a handcart with a cracked axle pin that he reinforced with wire, and he had his back. He started before dawn on September 27th. The first load was 80 pounds, 4 flat stones wrapped in burlap on the cart. The round trip took 3 hours because the cart bogged twice in low ground and a wheel pin bent on a root. He straightened the pin with a rock, reloaded, and pulled the cart home with a rope over his shoulder, leaning into the grade like a man pulling himself out of a well. By noon, he had 160 pounds of stone at the claim site. He needed 9,000. Nola watched him stack the first stones and asked how many trips it would take. Rowan told her he would count them later. He did not want to say the number out loud because the number was somewhere near 112, and saying it would make the task feel like what it was, impossible for one man in 56 days. The first pier began on October 1st. Rowan dug a shallow footing where the topsoil gave way to clay, set the broadest stone flat with its bed face down, and stacked the next stone with its weight centered over the one below. He worked by feel. the way his father had stacked corn crib piers, choosing stones that nested, rejecting rounds that would rock under load. The work was slow. A 4-foot column of dry stacked stone is not a pile. It is a negotiation between gravity and geometry, and every stone that sits wrong transfers its failure to the one above it. By October 5th, he had 3 piers standing. They looked crude, rough field stone tapering slightly from base to cap, standing alone on the empty prairie like monuments to stubbornness. Maddox drove past without stopping. A neighbor named Drucker stopped and said, "You building a dock, Mallow? River's that way." He pointed east and kept moving. The setback came on October 8th. Rowan loaded the cart heavy, 120 pounds of flat limestone he had spent an hour selecting at the creek. Halfway home, the axle cracked clean through where the wire reinforcement had worn a groove. The stones tumbled into the grass. Rowan stood over the broken cart with his hands on his knees and his breath coming hard, and for the first time since the letter from Asa, he felt the weight of the numbers. 9,000 pounds, 2 miles each way, alone. He fixed the axle with a splint cut from a cottonwood branch and rawhide soaked in the creek. It held, but barely, and the loads dropped to 60 pounds. The trips doubled. His hands split at the palms where the rope crossed them, and he wrapped them in strips of burlap that turned dark with blood and dirt. He lost weight he could not afford to lose. The children ate flour cakes and boiled prairie turnips, and Nola learned to keep the fire going while Rowan hauled stone in the dark. The weather gave its first warning on October 12th. A north wind arrived at dawn, hard and dry, carrying grit that stung exposed skin. The temperature dropped from the low 40s to the mid-20s in 4 hours. Rowan's water bucket grew a skin of ice by noon. The calendar said October, but the wind said winter was not waiting for the calendar. He had 5 piers standing and 7 to go. 56 days had become 40. The frost line was creeping down through the topsoil, and soon the ground would be too hard to dig footings without a pick he did not own. Every evening he checked the pier tops with a level made from a water-filled jar, and every morning the cold had shifted something a 1/4 inch. The stones were settling. The ground was moving. The clock was running, and Rowan was losing. He kept lifting, 1 stone at a time, 1 trip at a time, 1 pier at a time, because the alternative was a dirt floor, a sod bank, and children coughing through winter in a cabin that fought the cold by burning fuel he could not gather fast enough. And that alternative was not survival. It was a slower way to fail. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building? Rowan had no answer for the laughter yet. He only had another stone to lift. By the night of October 15th, 6 piers stood in the dark. The wind found the gaps between them and moaned a low note, like breath across a bottle. Rowan sat inside the half-walled frame with his children and ate cold flour cakes, and the firelight made the stone columns throw long shadows across the prairie like the legs of something enormous trying to stand. He did not know yet that help was coming. He did not know that a Norwegian mason named Tollef Assen was resetting culvert stones 3 miles east, watching the weather with the same unease Rowan felt, and that within a week the 2 men would stand over a tilted pier and argue about the proper way to read a stone. He did not know that the argument would change everything. What he knew was this: 6 piers stood. 6 more needed to stand. The skirt was not started. The roof was not on. The children were coughing, and winter was coming across the prairie like a debt collector, patient, certain, and uninterested in excuses. Rowan met Tollef Assen on October 17th at the rail culvert east of the settlement where the creek passed under the graded road. The culvert had washed out in a September rain, and the railroad section crew had left it half repaired, a gap in the stone wing wall where runoff had pulled the fill. Tollef was resetting the stones alone. He was 61 years old, Norwegian-born, with hands the color of smoked leather and a back that curved forward from decades of bending over masonry. He had built culverts, bridge abutments, and retaining walls for the railroad across 3 territories. He had not homesteaded. He lived in a boarding house in Huron and took contract work when his lungs allowed it, which was less often now than it had been 5 years before. Rowan was selecting stones from the creek cut when he noticed the old man working. He watched for a few minutes before approaching, not because he was cautious, but because the way Tolliff handled stone was different from anything Rowan had seen. The old man did not grab. He studied. He turned each piece in his hands, feeling the bed face, tapping the edge with a small hammer, listening. Then he set it with a motion that looked gentle, but was precise. The stone landed where it belonged, as if the wall had been waiting for it. Rowan approached with a flat limestone piece in his hands, a slab he had chosen for a pier cap. Tolliff looked at the stone before he looked at Rowan. "You carry it with the bed down," he said. "That means somebody taught you." "My father built corn cribs on stone," Rowan said. "Corn cribs?" Tolliff tested the word like he was testing a joint. "How high?" 3 feet, sometimes 4. "On what ground?" "Mountain, steep, wet in spring." Tolliff set down his hammer. "Show me what you are building." They walked to the claim site. Tolliff circled the 6 standing piers without speaking. He pressed his palm against the second pier and pushed. It did not move. He crouched and looked at the base, then stood and looked at the top. He walked to the 4th pier, which Rowan had built in fading light, and pushed again. This one shifted, a 1/4 inch, maybe less, but Tolliff's hand felt it before his eyes confirmed. "This one is wrong," he said. He pointed at a rounded stone near the bottom of the 4th pier. "You used a belly stone. It rolls under load. The pier leans from here." He tapped the offending stone with his hammer, a hollow sound. "Hear that? Loose fit. Air gap behind it. Water gets in, freezes, and the whole column walks." Rowan heard defiance in his own chest and swallowed it. "What should it be?" "Flat. Bed face down, always. Widest stones at the bottom, each course slightly narrower than the one below. The whole pier leans inward on every face. Weight tightens it. A pier that tightens under load does not walk." "Batter," Rowan said. Tolliff looked at him differently then. "Your father taught you that word?" "He taught me the shape. I did not have the word." "The word is batter," Tolliff said, "and it is the difference between a pier that stands and a pile that falls." He did not offer charity. He did not offer to build the piers for Rowan or to work for free. What he offered was correction. He would come by when his culvert work allowed, and he would show Rowan what he was doing wrong, and he would not repeat himself. "I do not teach men who do not listen," he said. "I teach men who look at the bottom of a stone before they lift it. That is you. Do not make me wrong." The teaching began the next morning. Tolliff arrived before dawn with his own hammer, a plumb bob on a string, and a bucket of sand. The first lesson was stone reading. Tolliff made Rowan reject every stone he had pre-selected for the 7th pier. One by one he held them up and explained what was wrong. This one had a hidden crack. Tap it and listen to the dead sound instead of the ring. This one had a curved bed face that would rock under weight. This one was too round. It would transfer its load to the edges and split the stone below it. Rowan carried each rejected stone to a discard pile that grew larger than the keeper pile. By mid-morning, he had 12 stones approved out of 40 candidates. "Good stone is scarce," Tolliff said. "That is why bad builders use bad stone. They cannot afford the time to choose." The second lesson was batter and load. Tolliff had Rowan rebuild the 4th pier from the belly stone up. Each course was set wider than the one above, so the pier tapered upward, not dramatically, but enough that the faces leaned inward at roughly 1 inch per foot of height. Tolliff checked the lean with his plumb bob, letting the string fall alongside the pier face and measuring the gap at the base. "When the cabin sits on this," he said, "the weight pushes down and the batter pushes in. The pier gets tighter. A straight pier under load stays the same. A battered pier under load improves." The third lesson came over the following days, worked into the spaces between culvert repair and stone hauling. Drainage. Tolliff made Rowan dig shallow trenches around each pier base and fill them with creek gravel, loose rubble that water could pass through without pooling. "Water under stone becomes a jack in winter," he said. "It freezes, it expands, it lifts. You cannot fight water. You can only give it somewhere to go." He showed Rowan how to pack gravel beneath the footstone so that meltwater drained away from the pier base rather than sitting against it. He showed him how to angle the capstone surface so rain sheeted off rather than pooling in hollows. He showed him how to use thin stone shims instead of pine wedges for leveling. Pine crushes, Tolliff said. He placed a pine wedge on a flat stone and struck it once with his hammer. The fibers compressed unevenly, leaving a slope. Stone on stone, always. Wood lies to you. By October 22nd, Rowan had rebuilt 2 piers to Tolliff's standard and built 2 new ones. The work was slower than before because good work is always slower than fast work. But the piers were different now. They did not look crude. They looked intentional. Columns that tapered slightly inward, capstones level within a quarter inch, drainage gravel packed at the bases like collars. 8 piers standing, 4 to go, 39 days until November, and every day the wind cut harder. The setbacks stacked like firewood that would not stay. On October 24th, Pike's fever returned. The boys shook under blankets in the roofless frame, while Nola heated water on the camp stove, and Rowan hauled stone in the dark because he could not afford to stop. He gave Pike willow bark tea and told Nola to keep him drinking, and he went back to the creek cut and loaded the cart by lantern light, his hands so split that the rope left pink marks on the burlap wrapping. On October 26th, Voss refused to sell straight-cut boards at any price. Rowan needed skirt lumber, pine planks, 4 feet long, enough to close the 16 by 22-foot perimeter. Without skirt boards, the crawl space would be open to wind, and the entire principle failed. Voss smiled and said he had straight boards, but they were reserved for paying customers, meaning customers who carried Voss's debt. Buy them on account, Voss said. 3% monthly, same as everyone. Rowan walked out. On October 28th, a north wind tore down the first loose skirt mock-up. Rowan had tacked salvage boards around the base of one pier section to test the wind load, and a gust ripped them off and scattered them across the claim like cards from a bad hand. The nails bent. 2 boards cracked along the grain. Rowan gathered the pieces and stacked them and stood in the wind with his jaw working, and he did not speak for an hour. Orrin Maddox arrived that afternoon, drawn by the noise or by curiosity, and he examined the 9th pier, which Rowan had just completed. He pressed it. He circled it. He crouched at the base and poked the drainage gravel with a stick. Then he stood and looked at Rowan with the expression of a man who has found his argument weakened but not broken. 1 pier moved, Maddox said. He pointed at the 5th pier, which had settled an 1/8 of an inch since morning. 1 is all it takes. The frame racks, the ridge drops, the door jams, and you cannot get out in a storm. He looked at the scattered skirt boards on the ground. And wind under a floor kills faster than frost through dirt. I told you that. The wind proved it. Rowan said nothing because Maddox was partly right. A loose skirt was worse than no skirt. The boards had to be tight, battened, chinked, and sealed at the bottom edge to stop wind from entering the crawl space. Anything less was an invitation. Rowan did not yet have the boards to do it properly, and every day he spent solving the board problem was a day he did not spend stacking the final piers. It was Nola who created the opening. She was at Beret Lund's that evening, helping with the baby. Beret's youngest had come down with croup, and Beret watched Nola carry water, stoke the fire, and heat a poultice without being told. The girl worked the way her father stacked stone, quietly, competently, watching before acting. Beret did not soften, but she bent. The next morning, Beret appeared at the claim site with her ox and a drag sled. She did not look at Rowan. She looked at Nola, who was trying to pull a flat stone on a rope across the grass, and at Pike, who was sitting on the woodpile with a blanket around his shoulders, counting hammer blows the way his father had taught him. "This is not belief," Beret said. "This is pity." Rowan accepted without pride. He hitched Beret's ox to the cart and made 4 trips to the creek cut in one day. 1,600 pounds of stone, more than a week's hauling done in 10 hours. The ox strained against the load on the uphill grade, and the cart groaned, and the axle splice held by a margin that made Rowan pray to things he did not usually address. That night he had enough stone for the final 3 piers. Pike's fever had broken. The wind was cold but steady, not gusting. Rowan stacked stone by firelight until his arms stopped listening to his brain, and when he slept, he dreamed of his father's corn crib standing on the mountaintop like a watchtower, its legs disappearing into cloud. By late October, 12 piers stood on the Dakota prairie. Rowan and Tolliff jacked the frame up together, a quarter-inch at a time, using cottonwood levers and cross-timber cribbing. The process took 4 days. Each lift was a fraction of an inch. Lever, crib, check, lever, crib, check, because dry stacked stone does not forgive a frame that drops unevenly. A half-inch misalignment at the sill becomes a full inch at the ridge, and a full inch at the ridge means a roof that sheds water to one side and collects it on the other. Tolliff checked every capstone with his plumb bob before the sill timbers touched them. He made Rowan reshim 3 piers. He argued about the center row, which Rowan had built a quarter-inch higher than the outside rows to crown the floor. "Crown sheds water," Rowan said. "This is not a bridge," Tolliff replied. "It is a floor. People walk on floors. Crown makes them dizzy." They compromised at 1/8 of an inch, which satisfied neither man and which was therefore correct. The sill timbers settled onto capstones. The frame, which had been a chest-high rectangle on bare dirt, was now a chest-high rectangle 4 feet above bare dirt, sitting on stone legs that tapered inward and drained at the base. From a distance, it looked like an animal crouching to spring. Rowan's hands had split and healed and split again. He had lost 12 pounds since September. The children had learned to hold lanterns and count hammer blows and pass tools without being asked. Nola could identify a belly stone by tap sound alone. Pike could say batter in English and in the Norwegian pronunciation Tolliff had taught him, which delighted the old man and annoyed Rowan for reasons he could not name. The skirt came next. Rowan had solved the board problem through barter. He traded 3 days of fence post splitting for a German-Russian family named Roth, and they paid him in pine offcuts from a dismantled freight crate. The boards were rough, uneven, and too short in places, but they were wood, and wood could be battened and chinked. He cut vertical planks 4 feet long, nailed them to horizontal rails fastened between the piers, and covered every seam with narrow batten strips. The gaps he chinked with a mix of clay, chopped straw, and ash, the same mixture his father had used in Appalachian cabin walls, applied with a wooden paddle and smoothed until the surface was tight enough to shed rain. At the bottom edge, he packed earth against the boards and tamped it solid. In true winter, snow would drift against the base and seal it further. On the lee side, he built 2 removable panels, boards held in place by wooden pegs that could be pulled in spring to open the crawl space for drying. Tolliff told him to peg them shut before true winter. "You will be tempted to check underneath," Tolliff said. "Do not. Every time you open the skirt, you let the wind in and start over." November settled over the prairie like a hand pressing down. The cabin was enclosed by mid-November. Walls closed, roof on, stovepipe drawing. The skirt sealed around the base, clay chinked and earth packed, standing 4 feet tall, like a wooden fence that went nowhere. From outside, the cabin looked wrong. Every other building in Ash Creek sat flat on the ground, banked with sod or dirt, hunkered down against the wind. Rowan sat up on stone legs with a wooden skirt hiding the gap, like a man standing on tiptoe in a crowd. Early performance gave Rowan numbers to hold, but not enough to prove anything. On a night when the outside air fell to 9 degrees, he placed 3 water pans, one outside on the ground, one on the cabin floor near the center, one in the crawl space underneath. The outside pan skinned over by midnight. The crawl space pan did not freeze. The floor pan formed only a thin rim of ice near the door, where the skirt seal was weakest. Rowan marked the readings in charcoal on a pine board nailed inside the door. Outside 9, under 36, floor 34. The numbers meant the crawl space was holding 27 degrees above outside air, and the floor was holding 25 degrees above. Not warm, not comfortable, but not frozen. The stove could fight a 34-degree floor. The stove could not fight a 9-degree floor. Orrin Maddox heard about the water pans and came to look. He studied the charcoal readings and pressed his boot against the floor. He did not say Rowan was right. He said, "Mild cold proves nothing. Wait for January." Beret warned him to watch for damp. If the sealed crawl space trapped moisture, the joists would rot from below, and by spring the floor would be sponge. Rowan checked by crawling through the lee panel on his belly with a lantern. The underside of the boards was dry. The stone piers were dry. The air in the crawl space smelled like cold clay, not like mold. He sealed the panel again and did not tell Beret, because telling her would invite an argument he did not need. Voss found a different angle. He began telling people that Rowan was hiding livestock under the cabin to warm the crawl space. "Mallow's got a cow under there," he said at the store. "That is his secret. Hot air from a cow." The men laughed because the image was funny and because laughing at Rowan was easier than thinking about what the water pan numbers meant. Tollef's health worsened through November. The cough that had been a companion became a master. He coughed blood into a rag after helping Rowan shim a capstone he should not have touched, and he sat on the frozen ground for 10 minutes with his eyes closed. When he opened them, he looked at Rowan with the clarity of a man who has started counting things he used to take for granted. "If the door sticks in cold," Tollef said, "do not kick it. Stone speaks first. Find which pier moved. The pier that moves tells you where the water is, and the water tells you where the frost is working." Rowan asked if Tollef would stay for winter. Tollef said he would stay as long as his lungs allowed, and not one day longer, because dying in a boarding house in Huron was bad enough without dying on someone else's claim. December passed in a gray blur of fuel cutting, snow, and the slow education of cold. Rowan burned cottonwood and twisted hay. He rationed flour. The children wore every layer they owned and slept together near the stove, and the floor beneath them stayed cold, but never frosted. The charcoal readings on the doorboard grew into a column. Outside temperatures dropping from the 20s into the teens and single digits. Crawl space temperatures holding in the upper 20s and low 30s, floor temperatures tracking 2 to 4 degrees below the crawl space. The pattern held. The method was working, but Tollef and Maddox and the prairie itself all said the same thing in different languages. "This has not been tested. Wait for the real cold." The sky gave signs in early January, sundogs, bright spots flanking the sun like sentries, a metallic quality to the wind as if the air itself had been forged, snow that fell not in flakes but in hard dry grains that rattled against the skirt boards like sand thrown at a window. Rowan knew these signs because Tollef had taught him what they meant on the open prairie, even though in the mountains the language was different. The translation was the same. Something was coming that would make everything before it feel like practice. January 12th, 1888 began as a lie. The morning was warm, not spring warm, but wrong warm, a softness in the air that had no business being there in the middle of a Dakota January. Snow slumped from roofs, icicles dripped, children walked to the Ash Creek school without heavy wraps, and mothers let them go because the sun was out and the wind had dropped to nothing, and the relief after weeks of bitter cold felt like a gift. Rowan did not trust it. The wind had gone wrong. It came from the south, which was unusual, and it carried a smell he could not name, wet metal, like a pump handle in rain. He stood outside the cabin at mid-morning and watched the southern horizon. The sky was clear. The temperature had risen above freezing. Pike wanted to play in the slush. Rowan told him to stay inside. Nola was not inside. She had gone to Beret Lund's at dawn to help with the baby, who had been feverish since the weekend. Beret's cabin was a half-mile north across open prairie, and Nola had walked it alone because the weather seemed kind and because she was 9 years old and trusted the sky. By early afternoon, the sky broke its promise. The storm came not as snowfall, but as a wall. One moment the southern horizon was clear, the next moment it was not there. A gray-black mass advanced across the prairie like a curtain being drawn across a stage, and it moved faster than a man could run. The temperature did not drop gradually. It fell as if someone had opened a door in the sky and let the cold pour through. Within an hour, the warmth was gone, replaced by a wind that drove snow sideways with enough force to sting exposed skin raw. Visibility collapsed. The cabin disappeared from the woodpile 20 feet away. The woodpile disappeared from the cabin door. Sound compressed into a single roar, wind driving snow against every surface, finding every gap, filling every hollow with white noise that erased direction. A man who stepped 10 feet from a building might never find it again. The prairie, which punished people for being too far from shelter, now punished them for being 10 feet from shelter. Rowan stood at the cabin door and looked north toward Beret's. He could see nothing. The half-mile between the two cabins might as well have been 100 miles. Nola was there. Pike was here. If he left Pike to get Nola, both children might lose their father to a storm that was killing visibility by the minute. If he stayed, Nola would survive or not survive depending on Beret's cabin, Beret's stove, and Beret's judgment. He tied a rope, one end around the cabin's corner post, the other paid out as he walked to the woodpile. 20 feet. He tied off and extended the rope to the next post. Then from the post toward Beret's fence line, using every length of rope and cord he owned, knotted together, stretched across open prairie where the wind hit him broadside and the snow blinded him and the cold entered his coat and went straight to the center of his body. He found Beret's fence by falling into it. The wire caught his shin, and he went down into a drift that was building against the posts. He followed the wire to the gate to the yard to the cabin door. He pounded with both fists. Beret opened the door and pulled him in. The cabin was dark except for the stove. The baby was crying. Nola was holding the baby near the stove, rocking, her face calm in the way that children's faces go calm when they are too frightened to show it. The floor was cold. Beret's cabin sat on dirt sills, low to the ground, banked with sod, built the way every cabin in Ash Creek was built. The floorboards near the walls had rimed with frost. The center of the floor was cold enough that the baby cried whenever Nola tried to set her down on the pallet. "We need to go," Rowan said. Beret said no. Her cabin was shelter. She would not leave it in a storm that was already killing visibility. She had been through Dakota winters before. The storm would pass. "Your floor is freezing," Rowan said. "The baby cannot stay on it." "The baby is on my lap," Beret said. "She will stay on my lap." "For how long? 2 days? 3?" Rowan looked at the door. "I have a rope line to my cabin. The floor there is not freezing." Beret stared at him. She was not a woman who trusted easily, and she was not a woman who abandoned her own shelter on a stranger's word. But the floor under her feet was telling her something she had felt every winter and never had a name for. The ground was stealing her heat through the boards, and the stove could not replace it fast enough. And in a storm that might last days, the arithmetic would break against her. She wrapped the baby in every blanket she had. She put Nola between herself and Rowan, and she held the rope with one hand and the baby with the other, and they went out into the storm. The half-mile took 40 minutes. Rowan pulled them forward hand over hand along the rope, which sagged and whipped in the wind, and at one point disappeared under a drift that had built in the 15 minutes since he had laid it. They found it by feel. Nola's hands went numb. Beret's shawl tore on the fence wire. The baby stopped crying, which was worse than crying, and Beret pressed her mouth against the blankets and breathed hot air onto the child's face until she screamed again. They reached Rowan's cabin. Pike was standing at the door with a lantern, his face white, his hands gripping the frame. Rowan pulled everyone inside and kicked the door shut against a wind that fought to follow them in. The floor was cold, but it was not frozen. Pike had kept the stove going, and the boards near the center of the room held a temperature that a barefoot could stand on. Not warm, not comfortable, but not the rimed, frost-feathered surface of Beret's low cabin. The children sat near the stove, and Beret set the baby on the floor pallet, and the baby did not scream. CTA, if you are invested in this story, subscribe and stay with us, because what happens next under the floor changes everything. An hour after dark, Rowan heard a sound under the cabin, a pounding, not wind, not a loose board, rhythmic, human. Something was hitting the skirt from outside at the base, near the lee side panel. He crawled to the removable panel and pressed his ear against it. The pounding came again, weaker. He pulled the pegs and opened the panel, and the lantern light fell on a man's face. Ned Carver, Voss's hired man, was wedged under the cabin against the skirt boards, curled on the frozen ground with his boots stiff and his hands white as candle wax. He had been trying to reach the store stable from the freight yard when the storm erased the 50 feet between them. He had crawled under the raised cabin because it was the only windbreak he could find, and the skirt had stopped the worst of the blast, and he had lived long enough to pound on the boards and pray someone heard. Rowan and Beret pulled him through the panel. His boots were frozen to his feet. His fingers had gone the yellow-white of deep frostbite. He could not speak. Rowan set him near the stove, and Nola brought water, and Beret unwrapped his hands with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had seen frostbite before and did not waste time on tenderness. The storm raged for 2 days. The wind did not stop. It paused, and then it hit again from a different angle, and the skirt screamed at the seams where the battens took the load. Snow dust blasted through a gap near the door where the earth seal had cracked. Rowan crawled under the floor through the lee panel with a lantern and a handful of clay and straw, and he packed the gap from inside the crawl space while the wind tore at the skirt 6 inches from his face. The crawl space was cold, but the air was still. The wind could not penetrate the sealed skirt with enough force to move the air pocket, and the ground beneath the cabin, sheltered from wind, insulated from the worst of the surface cold by the gravel packing and the sealed perimeter, held a temperature that kept the air above freezing. Rowan's store-bought mercury thermometer, hung from a joist, read 28 degrees at the edge of the crawl space and 36 near the center. Outside, the temperature had fallen to somewhere near 40 below zero with the wind. The floor above was not warm. It would never be warm. But it was not killing cold, and in a storm that was killing people on open prairie, not killing cold was the difference between a floor you could sleep on and a floor that froze the water in your lungs. On the second morning, Orrin Maddox fought his way to his own low cabin after spending the first night in the schoolhouse. He found a basin of water he had left on the floor. It was frozen solid to the boards. The ice had cracked the basin and bonded to the wood so firmly that he had to chip it free with a chisel. His floorboards were rimed from wall to wall. His stove had burned through the night, and the floor had frozen anyway because the frozen ground beneath the cabin had more cold to give than the stove had heat. He sat in his cabin with the chiseled basin in his hands and thought about 12 stone piers standing on the prairie, holding a floor 4 feet above the ground that was trying to kill everything on it. The storm broke on the morning of the 14th. The wind died first, then the snow thinned, then the sky opened with a cold so sharp and still that the silence felt physical. Rowan opened the door, and the world was white and alien and motionless. Drifts buried the fence posts. The woodpile was a snow mound. The skirt boards on the windward side were plastered with ice an inch thick. But the cabin stood. The piers had not moved. The skirt had held everywhere except the one gap he had patched. The children were alive. The baby was alive. Ned Carver was alive, though his fingers might not follow. And the floor that Orrin Maddox had said would freeze, that Beret Lund had called clever, that Leander Voss had laughed at, had held a temperature that a human body could endure, while the ground outside had tried to kill every living thing it touched. Rowan stepped outside and walked to the nearest pier. He pressed his palm against the cold stone. It was solid. It had not shifted. The batter held. The drainage held. The capstone was level. Tollef's teaching was in every stone, and the stones had done what Tollef said they would. They had tightened under load. He walked back inside and closed the door. Nola was feeding Pike flour cakes. Beret was nursing the baby. Ned Carver was staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone he used to know. The charcoal column on the doorboard had a new entry, the one that mattered. January 12, outside -40 wind. Under 28 edge, 36 center. Floor 34 center, 29 door. Held. The storm had killed stock across the territory. Children from a section farther west had gone missing overnight and were found alive in a haystack the next morning, half frozen and weeping. A cow was found standing dead in a drift, frozen upright. The school teacher's inkwell had burst on her desk, and in every low cabin in Ash Creek, the floors had iced. But not in the cabin on legs. Not in the house that Leander Voss had said needed roots. The floor had held because the stone held it up, and the skirt held the wind out, and the trapped air held more warmth than the frozen ground could steal. It was not magic. It was not even complicated. It was stone and wood, and the simple physics of keeping heat from running to the place that wanted to swallow it. The question that had driven the story from the first stone: is the hillman's mountain knowledge worth anything on the prairie? Had been answered in the only language the prairie spoke, which was survival. But the answer created new questions. The town had seen the storm. The town would now have to see the floor. And the man who had mocked the loudest, the man who stood to profit from Rowan's failure, would have to decide what to do with the fact that the fool house on stilts had just saved 5 lives while his own hired man crawled through the mud to hide under it. The town counted its losses before the drifts had finished settling. A milk cow frozen upright in a draw east of the schoolhouse. 2 children from the Pedersen claim 3 miles west, missing overnight and found alive inside a haystack at dawn, their lips cracked and their fingers blackened at the tips. Several low cabins with floor ice thick enough to hold boot prints. A freight wagon buried to its seat. And Ned Carver's hands. The left would recover, the doctor in Huron said, but the right would lose the smallest finger and most of the feeling in the one beside it. The storm shifted something in Ash Creek that could not be shifted back. It was not belief, not yet. It was attention. People who had laughed at 12 stone piers now looked at them without speaking. The laughter had been easy when the weather was mild. Mild cold tested nothing. The blizzard had tested everything, and the test results were visible to anyone who walked past Rowan's cabin and then walked past Orrin Maddox's. Maddox came first. He arrived on the morning of January 16th, 2 days after the storm broke, carrying a pry bar and wearing the expression of a man who expected to find a trick. He did not knock. He walked the perimeter of the skirt, pressing boards, checking the clay chinking, crouching to examine the earth seal at the base. He pulled one batten with his fingers, and it held. He stood and walked to the lee side panel and asked Rowan to open it. Rowan pulled the pegs, and Tollef's removable panel came free, and Maddox got on his knees and crawled halfway into the crawl space with a lantern. He was under there for 5 minutes. When he came out, his knees were wet with cold clay, and he had a piece of gravel in his hand from the drainage bed around the nearest pier. He stood and looked at the gravel, and then at Rowan, and then at the pier visible through the open panel. Beret was there. She had come to retrieve the baby's blankets. 2 neighbors, a German farmer named Roth and his wife, Truss, had stopped on the road to watch. Maddox was aware of the audience. A man who had built 7 houses in the territory and served as the unofficial authority on construction was standing in mud with a piece of gravel in his hand, and whatever he said next would travel through Ash Creek before nightfall. "I was wrong about the wind," Maddox said. He set the gravel on the skirt ledge. "You did not invite it under. You trapped it outside." He paused. His jaw worked as if the next words cost him something physical. "The air under there is still. I put my hand on the joist. It was cold, but it was not frosted. My joists frosted through from below." He looked at Beret. His floor held. Mine did not. He picked up the pry bar he had brought to find a trick, and he left without using it. He did not shake Rowan's hand. He did not congratulate him. But he had said what he said in front of witnesses, and in Ash Creek, a public statement from Orrin Maddox carried the weight of a surveyor's mark. The second validation came from Beret, and it came without softness. She appeared at the claim site 3 days after the storm, carrying a shovel. She did not bring praise. She did not say Rowan had been right. She set the shovel against the cabin wall and said, "Show me where the first stone goes." Rowan looked at her. "For what?" "My children sleep on the floor," she said. "That floor froze hard enough to split a water jar. I watched the baby scream every time Nola tried to set her down. Your floor did not do that." She picked up the shovel. "I am not raising the whole cabin. I am raising the sleeping room. Short piers, 2 feet. I can do that with the stone I have in the north pasture." Rowan said he would help. Beret said she did not need help. She needed instruction. There was a difference, and the difference mattered to her. She would lift her own stones and set her own piers and dig her own drainage. She needed to know the order, the spacing, and the mistakes to avoid. The rest was her labor and her problem. Rowan drew the pier layout in the dirt with a stick. 6 piers for a 10 by 12 sleeping room, 3 rows of 2. Footstones below the topsoil, gravel drainage around each base. Batter inward, 1 inch per foot. Flat capstones shimmed with stone, never wood. A half skirt around the base, chinked tight, sealed with packed earth at the bottom. Beret studied the drawing the way she studied weather, carefully, without comment, memorizing what mattered. Then she asked 3 questions. How deep does the footstone need to sit? How much gravel? What if she cannot find flat capstones? Rowan answered each one. Beret nodded once and picked up her shovel and left. She did not say thank you. She said, "If the piers heave, I will blame you." It was the closest thing to trust Beret Lund could offer a man she had called pitiful 2 months before. The third validation came unwillingly, and it came from Ned Carver's mouth whether Voss wanted it there or not. Ned had been moved to the boarding house in Huron 3 days after the storm. His hands were bandaged. His feet had recovered, but the right hand's smallest finger had turned black, and the doctor had taken it at the second knuckle. When people visited, and people visited because the blizzard had created a hunger for stories that proved how bad it had been, Ned told them what happened. He told them he had been crossing from the freight yard to the store stable, 50 feet, when the storm erased the distance. He told them he could not find the stable door. He told them he crawled on his hands and knees in a direction he thought was south, and found himself under a building he did not recognize, with boards on one side blocking the wind and open ground on the other. He had pressed himself against the boards and pounded until someone heard. "The only place I could breathe outside a building," Ned said, "was under Mallow's fool house." The phrase traveled. Ned did not mean it as a compliment. He meant it as a fact, the way a man states that a particular creek has water in it. He had crawled under the raised cabin because the skirt blocked the wind, and the crawl space gave him shelter that the open prairie did not. The word fool was Voss's word, repeated by habit, but the story it was attached to now worked against the man who had coined it. Voss tried to stop the story. He told Ned that talking about his employer's buildings was not appropriate for a hired man. He suggested that Ned's account was confused by cold and fear, that any building's lee side would have provided the same shelter. But Ned had crawled under the building, not beside it, and the distinction mattered. The crawl space error, the specific gap between ground and floor that the stone piers created and the skirt enclosed, had given him a windbreak and still air that the flat ground beside any low cabin could not match. The more Voss pressed Ned to stop talking, the faster the story moved. People repeated it with the small additions that make a story grow. Ned's frozen hands, the pounding on the boards, Rowan pulling him through the panel by lantern light. Each retelling made the cabin on stilts less strange and more interesting, and Leander Voss found himself in the position of a man who has shouted into a canyon and cannot stop the echo. Rowan shared the method freely through the rest of January and into February, and he shared it the way Tolef had taught him. Through demonstration, not lecture. He did not say build high and seal everything. He said measure your drainage, raise your wood above the ground, stop winter wind from passing under your floor, and open the panels in spring so moisture can escape. He walked families to their own cabins and showed them where the frost was climbing through the sills, where the wind was leaking under the floor, where the ground contact was turning their boards into conductors. He used water pans and candle smoke to demonstrate airflow. He pressed his palm against their floors and asked them to press theirs, and the cold that came through the wood made his argument better than any speech. Tolef helped him draw a simple pier spacing diagram on flour sack paper. Rowan sketched the layout. Tolef corrected the proportions. They argued over details the way 2 men argue over the best route to the same place. Not because either was wrong, but because each had arrived at the destination through different ground. "More sealed skirt," Rowan said. Tighter is better. Keep every breath of wind out. Spring ventilation, Tolliff said. You seal it for winter, fine. But if you seal it for summer, you build a rot box. Wood that cannot breathe dies from below, and you will not see it until the floor sags under your feet. Removable panels. Removable panels that people forget to remove. Mark my words, you teach 10 families, and by June, 8 of them will still have their panels pegged shut because opening them is work, and people avoid work they do not understand. They compromised. The diagram showed panels on 2 sides, lee for winter sealing, windward for summer opening, with a note in Tolliff's precise hand. Open both sides by May 1st, or the floor will punish you. Rowan added the pier spacing, 6 feet between columns for a standard cabin, 4 feet for heavy loads, gravel drainage at every base. Batter inward, stone shims, bed face down. The diagram was not beautiful. It was charcoal on cloth, smudged at the corners where hands had folded it, but it contained enough information for a man with stones and a level to build something that would keep his floor above freezing, and that was enough. February deepened the partnership between Rowan and Tolliff in ways that neither man would have predicted in October, when the old mason had walked to a stranger's claim and told him his 4th pier was wrong. They worked together on the cabin's spring improvements, replacing the weakest skirt boards, repacking the drainage gravel that frost heave had displaced, checking every pier for movement with the plumb bob. The work was not urgent. It was precise, and it gave them hours together in the crawlspace and beside the piers, talking in the way men talk when their hands are busy and their guards are down. Tolliff had been a railroad mason for 23 years. He had laid stone in Minnesota, Montana, and Dakota Territory. He had built culverts that carried spring floods without shifting, and bridge abutments that held rail weight without settlement, and retaining walls along cuts where the prairie soil wanted to slide back into the wound the graders had made. He had never owned land. He had never married. He had spent his life making things that other people used without knowing his name, and he spoke about this not with bitterness, but with the precision of a man describing a joint he had set correctly. Stone does not care who sets it, Tolliff said once, leveling a shim beneath a capstone. It cares whether you set it right. That is the honesty of stone. Wood will forgive a bad carpenter for years before it fails. Stone fails the day you make the mistake. Rowan asked about his family in Norway. Tolliff said he had left a sister in Bergen and had not written in 11 years because he did not want to describe what his life had become, which was a boarding house and a coffin contract work that paid less each year. He said this without self-pity, as a fact, and Rowan heard in the fact the reason Tolliff had come to his claim in October. Not charity, not kindness, but recognition. Tolliff had seen a man who looked at the bottom of a stone before lifting it, and he had seen in that man a chance to give what he knew to someone who would use it. The teaching was not generosity, it was survival of a different kind, the survival of knowledge that would otherwise die in a boarding house with a man whose lungs were filling. They clashed in late February over the center pier. Rowan wanted to add a 13th pier beneath the stove platform, where the weight was greatest and the heat transfer most critical. Tolliff said no. 13 was not the problem. The problem was that Rowan was solving the wrong failure. The stove area did not need more support. It needed better drainage because the heat from the stove warmed the floor above, and the warm floor created condensation on the underside of the boards, and condensation dripped onto the capstone and ran down the pier face and pooled at the base, and pooled water in spring became pooled ice in the following winter. "You're thinking about weight," Tolliff said. "Think about water. The weight is the load I can see. The water is the load that will destroy you. I have watched more stone fail from water than from weight. Weight is honest. Water is patient." They argued for an hour, crouched in the crawl space with lanterns, pointing at moisture lines on the pier faces, tracing drainage paths with their fingers. Rowan conceded. They deepened the gravel bed around the center piers and angled the grade so that any condensation runoff moved toward the perimeter rather than pooling at the base. The work took 2 days. It was invisible from above. The floor did not change. The piers did not change. but the water had somewhere to go, and that somewhere was not the base of a stone column that needed to stand for years. Tolliff collapsed on March 4th. He was showing a young settler from the Roth family how to dress a capstone, knocking the high spots with a mason's hammer, checking the flat with a straight edge, working the surface until it sat true. The capstone was heavier than it should have been for a man with his lungs. He lifted it to the pier top, set it, checked it, adjusted it, and then his knees gave and he went down on the frozen ground and did not get up. Rowan carried him to the cabin. Tolliff weighed less than the capstone he had just placed. His chest made a sound when he breathed that Rowan recognized from his wife's last weeks in North Carolina, a wet rattle like stones in a jar of water. Nola brought blankets. Pike brought tea. Beret came and looked at Tolliff and looked at Rowan and said nothing, because there was nothing to say about a body that had given everything it had to stone and weather and time. Tolliff spent 3 days in the cabin. He did not pretend he was recovering. He told Rowan he had a cousin near Yankton who would take him in and that the railroad would carry him there if he could reach Huron. He asked Rowan to help him to the boarding house, and Rowan said he would drive him in the cart. Before they left, Tolliff gave Rowan the plumb bob. It was a brass weight on a braided string, worn smooth by decades of hanging beside pier faces and wall courses and culvert joints. The string was stained dark with use. The weight was dented where it had struck stone. "Do not make them copy your house," Tolliff said. "Make them understand their ground. Every claim is different. The drainage is different. The wind exposure is different. The frost line moves. If you teach them a recipe, they will follow it into a place where it does not work and blame you when it fails. If you teach them to read their ground, they will build what their ground needs." Rowan drove him to Huron in the repaired cart. They did not speak much on the road. The prairie was white and flat and enormous, and the sky was the color of things that do not end. At the boarding house, Tolliff climbed down from the cart and stood for a moment with his hand on the sideboard, and then he walked inside without looking back. Rowan sat in the cart for a long time. The plumb bob was in his coat pocket. The brass weight pressed against his ribs like a second heartbeat, smaller and colder and more precise. He drove home in the dark. When he arrived, Nola asked where Tolliff was. Rowan told her Tolliff had gone to his cousin's to rest. Pike asked if he was coming back. Rowan said he did not know, and that was the truth, and the truth sat in the cabin like a guest no one had invited. The next morning, Rowan hung the plumb bob on a nail beside the door, next to the charcoal board with its column of temperature readings. The brass weight turned slowly in the draft from the stove, catching the light. It pointed straight down, the way it always had, the way it always would, regardless of who held the string. Spring of 1889 arrived not as a thaw, but as an assault. The snow did not melt gradually, it collapsed. Weeks of accumulated white turned to water in days, and the water had nowhere to go on the flat prairie except into every low place it could find. Creek beds that had been frozen channels became brown torrents. The road to Huron washed out in 2 places. Fields that had been hard white surfaces became mud lakes, and the cabins flooded. Low cabins, the kind every sensible person in Ash Creek had built, sat on dirt sills that the snowmelt found and followed. Water crept under the sod banking and pooled against the base logs and wicked into the floorboards. Beret's cabin took water at the north wall, where the sod had settled over winter. The Roth family woke to wet bedding. 3 cabins along the creek bottom had standing water under their floors, and the damp brought a sour smell that settled into clothing and flour sacks, and the children's coughs that had never fully healed from winter. Voss's storehouse flooded worst of all. The store was the largest building in Ash Creek, built low and solid on a plank-on-dirt foundation that Voss had laid himself to save the cost of a mason. The back room, where he kept flour, meal, sugar, and molasses in bulk, sat in a natural low spot that collected runoff from the road grade. By the second week of April, water had found its way under the back wall, soaked the floor joists, and ruined 14 sacks of cornmeal and 6 sacks of flour that represented half the settlement's spring food supply. Voss discovered the damage on a Tuesday morning and spent an hour throwing ruined sacks into the yard. The cornmeal had turned to gray paste. The flour had crusted into bricks that crumbled into mold. The loss was $200 or more, not enough to ruin Voss, but enough to make him stand in his own yard and stare at the foundation he had built and understand, in the specific language of ruined goods and spoiled food, what water does to a building that sits on the ground. Rowan heard about the flooding from Beret, who heard it from the Roth boy, who had been sent to the store for salt and found Voss throwing sacks into the mud. Rowan did not go immediately. He waited a day because arriving too fast would look like gloating, and Rowan understood that a man like Voss would rather lose more flour than accept help from a man he had mocked. He went on Thursday, with Beret and the Roth boy and a neighbor named Drucker, the same teamster who had once asked if Rowan was building a graveyard. They brought levers, cribbing timbers, and stones. Voss met them at the door and did not move aside. His eyes went to Rowan and stayed there. The silence between them held the weight of every joke, every raised nail price, every whisper about witnesses and failed claims. "Your back room needs to come up," Rowan said. 6 inches will clear the water line. A foot is better. We can crib it by evening if you clear the stock out. "I did not ask for your help," Voss said. "Your cornmeal asked for it," Beret said. She pushed past him into the store. They lifted the back room in 4 hours. It was not a full pier job. There was no time for that, and Voss would not have allowed it. They jacked the sill on cottonwood levers, set temporary cribbing under the joists, and packed stone pads beneath the cribbing to raise the floor above the waterline. It was crude and temporary, and it would need to be replaced before the next winter. But it stopped the flooding, and the remaining stock stayed dry, and Ash Creek did not lose the rest of its spring food supply. Voss said nothing while they worked. He stood in his own store and watched 4 men lift his building on principles he had called foolish, using techniques he had said would fail, led by the man he had tried to drive off the claim. When they finished, Rowan told him the cribbing would hold through summer, but that he should set proper piers before autumn. Voss said he would think about it. His voice was flat, emptied of the amusement and authority that had been there since September. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Rowan's idea no longer belonged to one cabin. It had become something neighbors could carry. That evening, Rowan handed Tolef's plumb bob to the Roth boy, 15 years old, named Gerhard, who had been watching the cribbing work with the intensity of someone memorizing a language. "Hold this against the post," Rowan said. "Tell me when the string hangs true." Gerhard held the plumb bob. The brass weight swung once, twice, and settled. "True," the boy said. "Good," Rowan said. "Now check the next one." It was the first time someone other than Rowan or Tolef had held the plumb bob on a job. It would not be the last. Voss's response to the flooding was not conversion. It was adaptation. Within a week of the cribbing work, Voss began selling pine boards cut to 4-foot lengths, the exact dimension of Rowan's skirt panels. He called them foundation boards and priced them at 18 cents per linear foot, which was 30% above his standard board price. When families came asking about raised floors, Voss directed them to the boards and offered credit at his usual terms. He did not mention Rowan. He did not mention the method. He sold the materials and let the customer assume the knowledge. Then he went further. He began telling certain customers, the newer families, the ones who had not been in Ash Creek during the blizzard, that proper pier construction required approved plans that he could provide for a fee. The plans were a rough sketch he had drawn after crawling under Rowan's cabin, copied onto brown paper, and stamped with his store mark. They were incomplete. They showed pier spacing but not drainage, batter but not gravel beds, and they were priced at 75 cents each. Orrin Maddox heard about the approved plans on a Saturday. By Monday, he was at the store. The conversation was public, held in front of 6 customers, and it was the only time anyone in Ash Creek had seen Maddox raise his voice at Voss. "There is no such thing as an approved plan for a pier foundation," Maddox said. "There is no building authority in this settlement, and if there were, it would not be a lumber merchant selling his own stock." Voss said the plans were a service. Maddox said the plans were incomplete and would cause failures that Voss would blame on the builder. Voss said Maddox had been wrong about the raised floor himself, Maddox said being wrong about a method was different from profiting off a bad copy of it. The argument did not settle the matter, but it moved the ground. By the following week, Beret Lund had taken Rowan's flour sack diagram, the one Tolliff had corrected, with the note about spring ventilation and the pier spacing and the gravel drainage, and pinned it to the wall of the schoolhouse, where anyone could see it and copy it for free. Voss saw the diagram on a Wednesday. He said nothing. But the approved plans disappeared from his counter, and the foundation boards dropped to 15 cents per linear foot, which was still above standard price but no longer an insult. The method was free. The materials were not. That was a tension Rowan could live with, because knowledge that required payment to access was not knowledge. It was leverage, and leverage was what had trapped every homesteader in Ash Creek under Voss's ledger in the first place. By the end of April, Rowan had helped 3 families begin work. Beret's sleeping room piers were set and shimmed. The Roth family was raising a sleeping loft floor above the damp ground in their one-room cabin. A widow named Elsa Kappelman, whose husband had died of fever the previous spring, asked Rowan to show her 15-year-old son how to set footstones. Rowan went to her claim and spent a day teaching the boy. Gerhard Roth came too, because the boys were friends, and because Gerhard had decided that holding a plumb bob once entitled him to hold it forever. Rowan refused payment beyond meals and labor exchange. This made him poorer and Voss angrier, because every family Rowan helped for free was a family that did not need Voss's credit for the same work. The community network that Rowan was building, one pier layout, one drainage lesson, one plumb bob check at a time, existed entirely outside the store ledger. It was not charity. It was trade conducted in knowledge rather than dollars, and knowledge, unlike dollars, did not accumulate interest for Leander Voss. But Rowan was teaching without Tolliff now, and the absence changed the work. Tolliff had corrected with authority. He had said, "This is wrong," and the wrongness was a fact, not an opinion. Rowan corrected with explanation, which took longer and carried less weight, because he was 34 years old and had been in Dakota Territory for 7 months, and the people he was teaching had been there for years. He heard Tolliff's voice in his own instructions. Bed face down, always, and the pier that moves tells you where the water is. And the borrowed authority held, but only because the blizzard had proved it first. He missed the old man in the crawl space, where the light was bad, and the air smelled like cold clay, and the plumb bob threw a shadow on the pier face like a pendulum measuring time that Tolliff no longer had enough of. He missed the arguments. He missed being wrong in the specific way that Tolliff made wrongness useful, not shameful, not punishing, but instructive, a correction that left the corrected person better than it found them. He hung the plumb bob back on the nail beside the door each evening, and each morning he took it down and put it in his pocket, and the weight against his ribs reminded him that the knowledge in his hands had been placed there by a man who had trusted him to carry it forward. That trust was heavier than any stone he had lifted. By the summer of 1889, Rowan Mallow had become the man people walked to when their floors went wrong. It started with small visits. A farmer from the Pedersen claim, 3 miles west, rode in to ask about drainage gravel. A Norwegian family named Solheim, who had arrived after the blizzard and heard the story secondhand, brought a wagon of fieldstone and asked Rowan to look at it and tell them which pieces were keepers and which were belly stones. A widow from the next section over sent her 12-year-old son with a drawing of her cabin's foundation and a question written on the back. "Where do I put the first pier?" Rowan answered every question the same way. He walked to the person's claim, looked at the ground, and told them what the ground told him. He did not give the same answer twice, because no 2 pieces of ground were the same. The Pedersen claim sat on a gentle slope that drained naturally to the south, which meant the piers needed less gravel but more attention to batter on the downhill side. The Solheim place was dead flat with clay soil that held water like a bowl, which meant deeper drainage beds and wider footstones. The widow's cabin sat on a low spot near a draw, which meant the spring flooding would test the skirt seal every year, and the removable panels needed to be built stronger than standard. This was what Tolliff had meant. Not a recipe. A reading. Each claim had its own language, and the language was written in the slope of the land, the color of the soil, the direction the water ran in spring, and the depth the frost reached in January. A man who learned to read that language could build for his own ground. A man who followed a plan drawn for someone else's ground would discover the difference when the frost heaved his piers or the water pooled at his sill. Rowan improved the design through the summer and into autumn. He developed shorter piers for smaller cabins, 2 feet instead of 4, enough to create a crawl space that could be sealed and vented without the full stone investment. He added diagonal braces between piers where wind exposure was high, using cottonwood poles notched into the pier caps and the sill timbers. He designed replaceable bottom skirt boards. The lowest course, which took the worst abuse from ground moisture and snow contact, that could be pulled and swapped without disturbing the sealed courses above. He built spring vents with wooden sliders instead of removable panels, because Tolliff had been right. People forgot to remove panels, but a slider that required only a push was harder to ignore. Around the perimeter of his own cabin, he packed a clay berm at the base of the skirt, a sloped ridge of clay and gravel that shed snow melt away from the boards and could be broken apart after thaw to let the ground breathe. The berm was not in the original design. It came from watching spring water find the bottom edge of the skirt and work its way through the earth seal. Every improvement came from watching a failure and understanding what the failure was trying to teach. Gerhard Roth became Rowan's most persistent student. The boy appeared at the claim site 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes with a purpose and sometimes without one, and Rowan gave him work because work was the only teaching method that held. Gerhard learned to read stone by tap. He learned to check batter with the plumb bob, holding the string against the pier face and measuring the gap at the base with a sliver of pine. He learned that drainage gravel had to be loose enough to let water pass and heavy enough to stay in place when the water moved fast. He was 15, and he already had the hands of someone who would build things for the rest of his life. The Kappelmann boy, Ernst, 14, came less often but worked harder when he did. His mother, Elsa, needed a raised sleeping platform more than a full pier foundation, and Rowan helped the 2 boys build it together. 6 short piers, 2 feet high, under a 10-by-8 sleeping area in the Kappelmann cabin. The work took 4 days. Ernst set every footstone himself, with Gerhard checking the plumb and Rowan watching from the side, correcting only when a mistake was about to become permanent. When the platform was finished, Elsa Kappelmann stood on it and pressed her bare foot against the boards. Her floor, the old floor, on dirt sills, was cold enough to ache through stockings. The raised platform was cold too, but the ache was absent. The difference was not temperature. It was contact. The old floor conducted cold from frozen dirt through wood into flesh. The raised platform held still air between the wood and the ground, and still air was a poor conductor, and a poor conductor was exactly what a sleeping child needed between their body and the frozen earth. Elsa did not thank Rowan, she thanked Ernst, which was the better gift. The cold snap came in late November of 1889, and it came for Leander Voss. The temperature dropped steadily through the 3rd week of November, falling from the 20s into the teens and then into the single digits over 4 days. It was not a blizzard. It was not dramatic. It was the slow, grinding cold that the prairie did best, cold that did not attack but simply persisted, hour after hour, until the things that needed warmth surrendered it. Voss's store floor froze on the night of November 23rd. Not the back room that Rowan's crew had cribbed in April das. That floor held because the cribbing raised it above the worst of the ground contact. The main room floor froze. The boards that ran from the front counter to the stove. The boards that customers stood on while they counted their money and signed their notes. The boards that Voss had laid on packed dirt 7 years ago because packed dirt was what sensible men used. The cold found the floorboards and froze them from below, and the frozen boards froze everything sitting on them. A molasses barrel in the corner, where the floor met the north wall, split along its bottom stave. The molasses, thick, dark, cold as river mud, spread across the frozen boards in a slow circle that froze before it reached the stove. A second barrel, half full of sorghum, cracked at the chime. Pickled goods in crocks along the wall grew ice rings inside the lids. Voss discovered the damage at dawn. He stood in his own store and looked at molasses frozen to his floor and sorghum leaking from a cracked barrel and frost feathering the boards under his boots. And he understood, not theoretically, not as an idea he could dismiss, but in the language of lost inventory and split staves, what frozen ground does to a floor that sits on top of it. The customers who came that morning saw the mess. They saw the frozen molasses and the cracked barrels and the frost on the boards. And one of them, Drucker, the teamster, who had once asked Rowan if he was building a graveyard, said the words that Voss had said 9 months earlier in this same room, in front of these same men, about a different building. A store needs roots, Voss, Drucker said. He did not smile. The other men did not smile. The phrase had traveled too far and carried too much weight to be funny anymore. It was a verdict delivered in the defendant's own language, and it landed with the sound of a door closing. Voss said nothing. He picked up a broom and started sweeping frozen molasses off his floor, which was a task roughly as productive as sweeping frost off the prairie. Rowan heard about the barrels from Beret, who heard it from the Roth boy, who had been in the store buying lamp oil. Rowan waited 2 days. Then he went to the store alone in the late afternoon when the customers had thinned. Voss was behind the counter, inventorying what he had lost. His ledger was open. His hands were still. He looked at Rowan the way a man looks at weather he cannot change. "Your main room needs 4 piers," Rowan said. "Short ones, 2 feet. Enough to get the boards off the dirt and put some air between them. I can help you do it in 2 days if you clear the stock to one side." "Why?" Voss said. The word was flat, stripped of everything except the question. "Because your floor is frozen, and your goods are splitting, and your customers saw it, and because a man who sells foundation boards should have a foundation worth showing." Voss set down his pencil. He looked at Rowan for a long time, and what passed between them was not forgiveness, and not friendship, and not even respect exactly. It was the recognition that one man had been wrong and the other had been right, and that the wrongness had not been malice. It had been certainty, which is malice's more respectable cousin. "I will clear the stock tomorrow," Voss said. They built the piers in 3 days, not 2, because the store floor was larger than Rowan had estimated, and the dirt beneath it had been packed so hard by years of foot traffic that digging footings required a pick. Gerhard Roth and Ernst Kappelmann helped. Beret sent food. Orrin Maddox came on the second day and checked the batter with his own level, not because he doubted Rowan, but because he wanted to see the work done correctly in the building where his opinion carried weight. On the third evening, when the last pier was shimmed and the floor was lowered onto the capstones and the stock was moved back into place, Voss stood in the center of his store and pressed his boot against the boards. The floor was cold. It would always be cold in winter, but the frozen bone cold was gone, replaced by the merely unpleasant cold of a board with still air beneath it instead of frozen earth. Voss looked at the men in his store, Rowan, Gerhard, Ernst, Maddox, Drucker, 2 customers who had stayed to watch, and he said what he had spent a year avoiding saying. He said it badly. He said it the way a man says something that has been dragged out of him by circumstances rather than offered by character. "Mallow's house had legs," Voss said, "because the rest of us were standing in a grave." The room was quiet. Rowan did not respond. There was nothing to respond to. The sentence was not an apology. It was an acknowledgement spoken by a man who had run out of alternatives, and it hung in the air of the store the way Tollef's plumb bob hung beside Rowan's door, pointing down true, regardless of who had finally let go of the string. Clara Whitcomb arrived in Ash Creek in the spring of 1890, and she arrived with a list. She was 30 years old, the new school teacher, hired after the previous teacher left for a railroad town with better pay. She had taught in 2 other prairie settlements, and she had learned the same lesson in both. Children who slept cold learned poorly. Children who slept damp got sick, and children who got sick in winter sometimes did not come back to school in spring. She carried a notebook in which she recorded which children arrived with cracked hands, which ones coughed through lessons, which ones fell asleep at their desks because their cabins had been too cold for rest. She heard about Rowan's raised floor within her first week, because the schoolhouse itself sat on dirt sills, and the floor froze every winter, and the children sat on benches with their feet on boards that conducted the cold of the earth into their boot soles and up through their bones into their attention spans. She asked Beret about it. Beret told her to talk to Rowan. Clara walked to Rowan's claim on a Saturday morning. She did not bring questions about construction. She brought her notebook. "I have 14 children in the school," she said. 6 of them sleep on floors that freeze in winter. 3 of those 6 miss more than a month of school each year due to illness. I want to know which families have raised their sleeping floors and which have not, and I want to know what it would take to raise the ones that have not. Rowan looked at the notebook. It was precise, organized, annotated in a handwriting so clean it looked like typeset. The entries were not sentimental. They were measurements. How many days missed, which months, which symptoms, which cabins. She had done what Rowan did with water pans and thermometers. She had turned an observation into numbers, and the numbers made the observation impossible to dismiss. "I can walk you to each cabin," Rowan said, "but I cannot make anyone build." "I do not need you to make them build," Clara said. "I need you to show them what their floor is doing to their children. The numbers do the rest." They visited 6 families over the following weeks. At each cabin, Rowan checked the floor, the sill, the ground contact, and the drainage. Clara recorded the measurements. At 3 of the 6, the families had already heard about the method and lacked only the confidence or the knowledge to begin. Rowan drew pier layouts in the dirt. Clara copied them into her notebook with dimensions and notes. At the other 3, the families were skeptical or short on labor, and Clara left the notebook open on their tables with the attendance numbers facing up, and she said nothing about foundations and everything about the children who were missing school, and the silence she left behind was more persuasive than any argument. She did not flatter Rowan. She did not treat the method as genius or the man as a hero. She treated both as tools, effective, practical, available, and she used them the way she used her notebook, with precision and without sentiment. Rowan found this clarifying. He had spent a year being mocked, then doubted, then grudgingly respected, and the emotional noise of each phase had made it hard to see the work clearly. Clara saw the work the way Tolif had seen stone, as a problem with a solution, where the solution was measured in degrees and inches, and the number of children who showed up to school in January. The courtship, if it could be called that, developed through shared labor. Clara helped Rowan copy the flour sack diagram onto paper, cleaner, more legible, with measurements written in her precise hand. She taught the older children at the school to read the mercury thermometer that Rowan had mounted on the schoolhouse wall, turning his survival tool into a lesson in observation. She organized a Saturday when 3 fathers came to the schoolhouse, and Rowan showed them how to set short piers under the entry platform, raising the doorway threshold above the mud and snowmelt that pooled there every spring. Rowan was drawn to her competence, which he recognized the way Tolif had recognized his, not as charm, but as evidence. She did not need him to explain things twice. She did not need him to justify the method. She needed him to show up, do the work, and let the results speak in the language she could record. Clara was drawn to something she told Beret about in May, when Beret asked her directly, because Beret asked everything directly, whether she intended to marry the hillman. Clara said, "He knows something that could make every cabin in this settlement safer, and he gives it away. I have met men who hoard much less." They married in October of 1890 in a plain ceremony at the schoolhouse, with Beret and Orrin Maddox as witnesses. Pike held the rings. Nola held a lantern because the afternoon had turned dark early and the schoolhouse windows were small. The plumb bob hung in Rowan's coat pocket, and when Clara asked what was pressing against her shoulder during the ceremony, he showed her, and she said, "You brought a tool to your own wedding." And Rowan said, "It is not a tool, it is a debt." And Clara understood because she had heard enough about Tolif Asen from Beret and from the children to know what the brass weight meant. The years compress the way years do when the crisis has passed and the work becomes the life. By 1891, Ash Creek had 8 raised or partially raised cabins, 3 skirted sleeping rooms, and 1 schoolhouse entry platform built on stone pads. Not every family had adopted the full method. Some used short piers under sleeping areas only. Some used sealed skirts without full pier systems. Some used better drainage and raised sills without piers at all, applying the principle to separate wood from frozen ground, stop wind under the floor, in whatever form their labor and materials allowed. The schoolhouse kept a copy of the pier spacing diagram pinned near the stove. Clara had redrawn it on stiff paper with ink, adding Tollef's ventilation note and Rowan's drainage specifications. The children called it the floor map. Gerhard Roth, who was 17 now and building piers on his own, told the younger children that the floor map was the most important thing in the schoolhouse, more important than the alphabet chart, and Clara let the claim stand because it was closer to true than Gerhard knew. Rowan proved up his claim in the spring of 1891, with Orrin Maddox and Bure Lund as witnesses. The hearing was at the land office in Huron, and Maddox testified that the claim improvements included a timber cabin of 16 by 22 feet, raised on stone piers, with an enclosed and skirted foundation, a shingled roof, a plank floor, and a stone-lined drainage system. He described the construction in detail and without qualification. He did not mention that he had once told Rowan that a man who had never wintered on level ground should not improve on the people who had. Bure testified that the claim was occupied continuously, that the children attended school, and that the homesteader had contributed labor and knowledge to the settlement. She described the pier method and its spread to neighboring cabins. She did not mention that she had once called Rowan's effort pity and his method cleverness. She said what was true in the present and let the past hold its own weight. The claim was proved. The land was Rowan's. 160 acres along the James River Prairie in Dakota Territory, held by a man from Yancey County, North Carolina, who had arrived with $38, a cracked cross-cut saw, and 2 children who coughed into mittens that had gone dark with use. Pike grew into the one who checked the spring vents. Every May, he walked the perimeter of the cabin and pulled the sliders open, one by one, letting the winter air out and the spring air in. He checked for moisture on the pier faces. He checked for gravel displacement in the drainage beds. He reported his findings to Rowan the way a sailor reports sea conditions, factually, without interpretation, trusting the man who had taught him to act on the information. Nola learned to set a plumb line. She held the string against pier faces and read the gap with her eye, and she could tell within 1/8 of an inch whether a pier had shifted over winter. She did not love the work the way Gerhard loved it. She loved the precision, which was different. The precision was a language she could speak without persuading anyone, and in a settlement where women's opinions about construction were tolerated rather than sought, precision was the only authority that did not require permission. Clara and Rowan had 2 more children, a boy named Halvor, born in 1892, and a girl named Sigrid, born in 1894. The cabin grew. Rowan added a room on the south side, raised on 4 new piers that he and Gerhard built in a single day. The skirt extended. The drainage extended. The plumb bob came off the nail beside the door each time new stone was set, and each time it went back, the dent in the brass was a little deeper from the work. Rowan never became rich. The claim produced enough to hold check in wheat in good years, hay in poor ones, a kitchen garden that Clara managed with the same precision she applied to everything. He never charged for teaching. He never wrote the method down as a book or a pamphlet or a patent claim. He gave it the way Tollef had given it to him, in person, on the ground, 1 pier at a time, correcting what was wrong and approving what was right and sending people home to build for their own ground. He became the man called when a door stuck after frost, the man called when a floor rotted from below, the man called when a widow could not lift a sill alone and needed someone who would come without a ledger. His cabin remained visibly odd. The stone legs, the wooden skirt, the removable panels that Pike opened every spring. But no one laughed. The legs had held. The floor had not frozen. The children had slept. Word came from Yankton in the autumn of 1893 that Tollef Ossen had died at his cousin's farm. The cousin sent a letter through the railroad mail addressed to the Hillman at Ash Creek. The letter said Tollef had spoken of Rowan's piers in his final weeks, and that he had asked his cousin to tell Rowan one thing. The stone held. Rowan read the letter standing at the door of the cabin, where the plumb bob hung on its nail. He read it once, folded it, and put it in the pocket where the brass weight usually lived. Then he took the plumb bob off the nail and held it in his open hand and let the weight settle, the string hanging straight and true, pointing at the ground the way it had always pointed at the ground, the way it would always point at the ground because gravity does not grieve and brass does not forget. He hung it back on the nail and went to help Beret fix a drainage trench. By the early 1890s, a dozen families around Ash Creek had used some part of Rowan's method: stone pads, raised joists, sealed winter skirts, spring vents, better drainage. Not every cabin stood on 4-foot piers, and not every family had the stone or the labor for a full system. But the principle had taken root in the settlement the way a seed takes root in ground that has been prepared for it, unevenly, imperfectly, and with enough hold to survive. The schoolhouse kept the flour sack diagram pinned near the stove, redrawn in Clara's hand, annotated by children who measured the thermometer each morning and wrote the number in chalk on a board beside the door. They called it the floor map, and the name held because it described exactly what it was: a way to read the ground beneath your feet and build something that the ground could not destroy. Rowan Mallow lived out his life on the claim he had nearly lost. He and Clara raised Nola and Pike and Halvor and Sigri in the cabin on stone legs, and in later years he walked with a limp, the right knee. Damaged the winter, he crawled under the skirt in a blizzard to pack a gap with clay while the wind tore at the board 6 inches from his face. The plumb bob from Tolef, Asen, hung beside the door until the nail wore a groove in the wood, and when Rowan replaced the nail, the new one wore a groove in the same place, as if the wall remembered what was supposed to hang there. On the anniversary of the blizzard, each January, snow packed against the skirt boards the way it always did, and the wind moved across the prairie the way it always had, and under the cabin the air stayed still. Rowan would rise before the children and set his bare foot on the center floorboard, not because the room was warm, but because the floor was not an enemy. It did not freeze. It did not steal. It held the space between the living and the frozen ground and kept them apart, the way 12 stone piers kept the wood apart from the dirt, the way a man's stubbornness keeps his family apart from the verdict of people who have never had to build on nothing. Outside, the ground was locked hard. Inside, the children slept without lifting their blankets from ice. A house needs roots, Voss had said, but roots sit in the earth, and the earth freezes, and the roots freeze with it, and everything built on frozen roots dies from below. Rowan had given his house legs instead, and the legs stood on stone, and the stone stood on ground that could not reach the floor, and the floor held because the man who built it had listened to the bottom of every stone before he lifted it. The town had laughed at the legs beneath his house, until winter taught them what roots could not do.